The oppressive Texas heat was a living thing. A thick, wet blanket of air, pushing 100 degrees, settled over the manicured suburb of Oakhaven, turning the asphalt of the highways into shimmering mirages and making the air so dense you could taste it. Nowhere was this oppression felt more keenly than on the pristine emerald expanse of the Oakhaven Hills Country Club, a playground for the wealthy where the grass was kept an unnatural green in the midst of a scorching Texas summer. For the members, the heat was an inconvenience met with ice towels and air-conditioned golf carts. But for the staff, it was a brutal test of endurance. Maya, a young woman of 24 with sun-streaked brown hair pulled back in a fraying ponytail and hazel eyes full of a quiet resolve, readjusted the heavy strap of the golf bag on her shoulder. Her uniform, a white polo shirt that had seen too many washes and khaki shorts that had been mended twice, clung to her skin. Here, she was invisible, a ghost in the machine that kept the upper crust comfortable. Yet, beneath her quiet exterior was a spine of steel forged in years of struggle. She wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, her gaze darting anxiously toward a thick cluster of ornamental azalea bushes near the 13th hole. Tucked deep in the shade of those bushes was the only thing in the world that was truly hers. Max, a German shepherd puppy barely 3 months old, was panting in the dirt. He was a fluffy ball of dark fur and oversized paws, with ears that had just started to stand but still flopped over adorably whenever he cocked his head. Maya had rescued him from a cardboard box on the side of the highway just 2 weeks prior, and with no money for a sitter and having been kicked out of the staff dorms that very morning for the unauthorized pet, she'd had no choice but to bring him to work. She'd left him a bowl of water and a stern command to stay put, but the relentless heat had evaporated the offering and turned his small hiding place into an oven. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs, not from the exertion of carrying the heavy clubs, but from the terrifying possibility of being discovered. She needed this job. The collection agencies calling about her late mother's medical bills were not known for their patience, and the tips at Oakhaven Hills were the only thing keeping her afloat. "Hey, Caddie, are you deaf?" The voice cut through the heavy air like a whip. Maya snapped to attention, forcing a polite smile as she turned toward the source of the noise. Trent Covington, a young man in his early 20s who wore his entitlement as casually as his expensive pastel polo, was glaring at her. He was conventionally handsome, polished with slicked-back blonde hair and a jawline that suggested he'd never been told no in his life. As the son of the town's leading candidate for state senator, Trent moved through Oakhaven with the smug air of a prince surveying his kingdom. With him were 3 friends, a co-ed group who laughed too loudly and checked their phones too often, their expensive sunglasses reflecting the misery of the caddy serving them. "I asked for a 9-iron, not the driver," Trent sneered, dropping the club Maya had handed him onto the grass with a contemptuous thud. "God, the help these days, it's like they hire anyone off the street." One of the girls in the cart, wearing a white visor and holding a sweating glass of lemonade, giggled. "Maybe she's just distracted by the heat, Trent." "Don't be so hard," she said, though her tone lacked any real empathy. Maya swallowed the lump of humiliation in her throat. "My apologies, sir," she said, her voice even despite her trembling hands. She retrieved the correct club, wiping the grip with a towel before handing it to him. She could feel the eyes of other members on them. Further down the course, a few older gentlemen were shaking their heads, and a lone figure stood near the clubhouse terrace, watching. But Maya didn't dare look up. She just needed to get through the next 5 holes. Just 5 more, and she could grab Max, find a cheap motel, and figure out tomorrow. But fate, it seemed, was wilting under the sun as fast as the flowers. As Trent set up for his shot, taking powerful practice swings that sliced through the air, a rustling came from the azalea bushes. The heat had become too much for the puppy. Driven by instinct and desperation, Max stumbled out from the foliage. He didn't bark or growl. He just padded clumsily onto the green, his tongue lolling out, his dark eyes wide and confused as he searched for the water bowl that had evaporated hours ago. "What is that rat doing on the course?" Trent yelled, breaking his stance. The sudden noise startled Max, who yelped and trotted closer to the group, perhaps thinking these humans might have water. The puppy stopped a few feet from Trent's expensive golf shoes, wagging his tail uncertainly. "Get away from me," Trent recoiled as if the dog were a venomous snake. "You filthy mutt." The frustration of a bad round, the heat, and his own inherent cruelty converged in a single flash of rage. Trent didn't just shoo the dog away. He gripped the 9-iron with both hands, his face twisting into an ugly mask of fury, and he swung. The sound was hideous, a dry, sickening thud of metal meeting young bone. Max shrieked, a high-pitched, soul-shattering sound of agony that froze the blood of everyone around. The puppy collapsed in a heap, whimpering in pain, his back leg bent at an unnatural angle. "No." The scream ripped from Maya's throat, raw and primal. She dropped the golf bag, the heavy clubs clattering to the path, and sprinted toward the fallen puppy. She didn't care about the job, she didn't care about the senator's son or the debt. She threw herself onto the grass, shielding Max's trembling body with her own. "What did you do?" "He's just a baby," she cried, tears instantly blurring her vision as she reached out to comfort the animal. Trent, adrenaline and arrogance surging through him, looked down at her with pure disdain. He wasn't horrified by his actions. He was annoyed by the interruption. "Get that thing off the green," he snarled. "And get off my course. You're fired. I'll make sure my father hears about this incompetent mess." Maya looked up, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her eyes blazing with a hatred she had never allowed herself to show. "You're a monster," she whispered. The insult was the spark to the powder keg of Trent's ego. "What did you say?" he hissed. He stepped forward, his shadow falling over Maya and the whimpering dog. "You don't get to talk to me like that." Without hesitation, he swung his hand. The slap echoed across the silent green, sharp and brutal. The force of it knocked Maya sideways, her cheek stinging as if branded. She gasped, curling tighter around Max, bracing for the next blow. She saw Trent's knuckles go white as he raised the golf club again, not to hit a ball, but to strike at the girl and the dog who had dared to ruin his afternoon. The club was raised high against the sky, glinting like an executioner's blade. Maya squeezed her eyes shut, saying a silent prayer, feeling the puppy's rapid, terrified heartbeat against her chest. But the blow never landed. The air shifted. A shadow moved faster than the eye could follow. There was no shout, no dramatic warning, just a sudden, dull thud of flesh stopping metal. Maya opened her eyes. Standing over her was a man she hadn't seen approach. He was tall with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of a simple black t-shirt. His skin was tanned from years in a relentless sun, and a faint, jagged scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into a military-style buzz cut. This was Caleb Rourke. He looked nothing like the soft, manicured men who frequented Oakhaven Hills. He looked like he'd been carved from granite and weathered by sandstorms. His large, calloused hand had caught the golf club shaft in mid-swing, inches from Maya's head. His grip was like iron. Trent blinked, confused, trying to wrench the club back, but it wouldn't move. He looked into Caleb's eyes and froze. They were eyes that had seen things Trent couldn't conjure in his nightmares, cold, calm, and terrifyingly empty of fear. Caleb didn't say a word. He just stood there, a silent barrier between privileged cruelty and helpless innocence. The heat of the day seemed to break against his stillness like waves against a cliff. The silence that fell over the 13th hole was absolute, heavier than the humid air pressing down on the earth. For a moment, the only sounds were the agonized whimpers of the German Shepherd puppy writhing on the grass and the faint, distant drone of a lawnmower that seemed a world away. Caleb stood like a monolith, his hand still clamped around the shaft of the 9-iron, his grip unyielding. Trent, the young man whose face had been a mask of arrogant rage only seconds before, now looked at the stranger with a dawning, primal fear. He tried to pull the club back, his knuckles white with the strain, but the steel shaft didn't move a millimeter, held fast by a strength that felt less like muscle and more like hydraulic pressure. Caleb didn't shout. He didn't even raise his voice. He just stared at Trent with eyes that held no anger, but a cold, calculating appraisal. It was the look of a predator deciding if the prey was worth the energy of the kill. "Let go," Caleb said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the chests of everyone standing near. It wasn't a request. Trent's fingers opened automatically, his bravado dissolving as survival instinct took over. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own expensive golf shoes, putting distance between himself and the man who had materialized out of the heat haze like an avenging spirit. Caleb looked at the club in his hand, a symbol of leisure that had been turned into a weapon of cruelty. With a single, shockingly fluid motion, he brought the shaft down hard over his own knee. A sharp, metallic crack echoed like a gunshot across the green. He tossed the two broken halves onto the manicured turf at Trent's feet, the metal clattering with a finality that made the young man flinch. "You don't deserve to hold this," Caleb stated, his tone flat and factual. Then he turned his back on the group, dismissing them as if they were nothing more than insects, and knelt beside Maya and the injured dog. The transformation was immediate. The hard set of his shoulders softened, and the hands that had just snapped steel moved with the delicate precision of a surgeon. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a quiet baritone meant only for the girl and the animal. "I've got you." Maya, still trembling on the grass with tears tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks, looked at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. She saw the jagged scar that ran along his jaw, And the way his eyes scanned the puppy's injury with a professional objectivity mixed with a deep, quiet empathy. "He's hurt bad," she choked out, her hand hovering over Max, afraid to touch him and cause more pain. "I know," Caleb answered quietly. "We need to immobilize the leg." He didn't ask for permission. He took command. His eyes scanned the immediate area, his mind running through the TCCC, Tactical Combat Casualty Care, protocols that had been drilled into him over a decade of service. He reached into Maya's abandoned golf bag and pulled out an alignment stick, a thin rod used for practice. "Hold his head," he instructed Maya, his tone gentle but firm. "He might bite from the pain. It's not his fault. Just instinct. Trust me." Maya nodded, wiping her tears on her shoulder and gathering Max's head into her lap, whispering soft reassurances into the dog's fur. Caleb pulled a clean, if sweat-stained, bandana from his pocket. With efficient, practiced movements, he used the stick and the cloth to fashion a crude but effective splint for the dog's broken leg. Max let out a single, piercing whine of pain, but he didn't struggle, perhaps sensing that the big hands working on his leg were there to help, not harm. "Good boy," Caleb murmured, tying off the knot. "You're a little soldier, aren't you? Tough little guy." The peace of the moment was shattered by the whine of an electric motor. A white golf cart bearing the Oakhaven Hills Management logo sped across the grass, chewing up the turf in its haste. It skidded to a stop and Mr. Davis, the club manager, jumped out. Davis was a man in his 50s who wore his anxiety like a second skin. He was balding with a comb-over that failed to hide the sheen of sweat on his scalp, and his suit was a size too tight around his expanding waistline. He was a creature of compromise, a man who had spent his life bowing to money and power. He ignored the weeping girl on the ground. He ignored the whimpering puppy. He ignored the stranger. His eyes went straight to Trent, the VIP's son. "Mr. Covington. Oh, my goodness. I saw the commotion from the clubhouse," Davis panted, his voice dripping with sycophantic concern. "Are you all right? Are these people bothering you?" He gestured vaguely at Maya and Caleb as if they were trash that had blown onto the course. "I am so sorry, Trent. We try to keep the riffraff out, but sometimes they slip through. We'll handle this immediately." Caleb slowly rose to his feet. He towered over the manager, casting a long shadow that seemed to swallow the smaller man. The temperature of the air seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Riffraff?" Caleb repeated the word, tasting it like spoiled milk. Davis turned, annoyed at the interruption, ready to dismiss another servant, but the words died in his throat as he looked up and met Caleb's face. "This boy," Caleb pointed a calloused finger at Trent, who was trying to regain his composure by checking his phone, "just assaulted an employee and shattered a puppy's leg with a 9-iron. And you're apologizing to him?" Davis blinked, his eyes darting nervously between Trent and Caleb. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at his upper lip. "Now, see here," Davis stammered, trying to sound authoritative. "Mr. Covington is a valued member. I'm sure it was an accident, and frankly, pets are strictly forbidden on the course. That girl was breaking the rules. She's the one who's liable here." The injustice of it hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Caleb took one step forward, invading Davis' personal space. "Liable," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. "Is that what you call it?" He leaned in, his face inches from the manager's. "I watched you run past a bleeding animal and a crying girl to kiss the ring of a spoiled child. I remember your face, Davis. I have a good memory for faces, and I will remember this cowardice." The word cowardice landed like a physical blow. Davis flinched, his face turning a blotchy red. Around them, the atmosphere had shifted. The commotion had drawn the attention of other golfers. A group of older women, the Morning Bridge regulars, had stopped their carts nearby. An elderly gentleman, a retired Marine with a stiff knee and sharp eyes, was leaning on his putter, watching intently. Phones had been drawn. Red recording lights were blinking. The audience was silent, but their eyes were judging. They weren't looking at Maya with disdain. They were looking at Trent with disgust and at Caleb with a dawning respect. Trent, feeling the tide turning and his ego pricked by the silence, decided to play his trump card. He stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "You're done," he snarled at Caleb. "You think you can come here and threaten us? Do you have any idea who my father is? He runs this whole county. I can have you arrested for property damage and assault before you even make it to the parking lot." The threat hung in the air, a classic weapon of the privileged, used to crush dissent for generations. Maya, still on the ground, looked up in terror. She knew the power the Covington family held. She reached out, grabbing the hem of Caleb's jeans. "Please," she whispered. "Just go. Don't get in trouble because of me." Caleb looked down at her, his expression softening for a fraction of a second before he turned his gaze back to Trent. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He walked over to where Max was lying, bent down, and lifted the puppy into his arms as easily as if he weighed nothing. The puppy gave a small whimper and sagged against Caleb's shoulder. Caleb then offered his free hand to Maya. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you out of this snake pit." Maya took his hand, her small, rough palm disappearing in his, and he pulled her to her feet, steadying her with one arm while holding the dog with the other. Caleb turned to face Trent one last time. "I don't care who your father is," Caleb said, his voice ringing out clear across the green, captured by a dozen cell phones and seared into the memory of all present. "A father doesn't define a man. His actions do. And I know exactly who you are." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of judgment settle on Trent's shoulders. "You're a coward, and cowardice is a dangerous thing to be when the whole world is watching." With that, he turned and started to walk away, his boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel path. He didn't look back. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace, shielding the battered girl and the broken dog from the harsh sun, leaving the rich boy and the spineless manager standing in the wreckage of their own reputations, while the silent applause of the onlookers followed him like a protective wave. The drive from the oppressive heat of the Oakhaven Hills Country Club to the outskirts of town was made in a heavy, contemplative silence. Caleb drove his old but impeccably maintained Jeep Wrangler with the same steady precision he applied to everything else. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, not from anger, but from a residual adrenaline that hummed under his skin like a live wire. Beside him, Maya sat huddled in the passenger seat, cradling the splinted puppy in her lap as if shielding him from the vibrations of the road. She stole occasional glances at the man beside her, this stranger who had walked out of the sun like a mythological guardian. He was a puzzle she couldn't solve. His face was hard, etched with lines that came from squinting into desert storms, yet his presence felt safer than any fortress. They turned down a gravel road lined with ancient oak trees, the tires crunching softly as they pulled up to a converted farmhouse. A hand-painted sign swung gently in the breeze, Peterson's Veterinary Clinic, large, and small animals. It wasn't a sterile, glass-fronted hospital. It was a place of warmth and earth, a sanctuary that smelled of pine needles and rubbing alcohol. Caleb killed the engine and was out of the Jeep before Maya had her seatbelt off. He opened her door and gently lifted the whimpering puppy from her arms. His transfer was so smooth that Max barely stirred. "Sam's the best," Caleb said, breaking the silence. "He doesn't care about money or insurance. He cares about the life in front of him." They entered the clinic to the cheerful jingle of a bell over the door. The waiting room was empty save for a tabby cat sleeping on the reception counter. From the back, a man emerged, wiping his hands on a towel. Dr. Sam Peterson was a man who wore the sturdy dignity of his 70 years like an old oak. He had a shock of unruly white hair that refused to be tamed, thick glasses perched on a nose that had been broken at least once, and intelligent, kind blue eyes that had seen too much suffering to be shocked by it anymore. He wore a set of blue surgical scrubs tucked into faded blue jeans, and the faint, almost invisible tattoo of a caduceus medical symbol was visible on his forearm, faded with time but still proud. "Caleb," Sam said, his voice a warm, gravelly rasp, without the surprise one might expect. "Didn't know you were back in town, and you brought company." He looked at the puppy in Caleb's arms, his professional demeanor clicking into place instantly. "Bring him in the back. Table 2. The next hour was a blur of hurried activity. Maya sat in the waiting room, twisting her hands in her lap, listening to the murmured voices of the men and the clink of instruments. She felt small and helpless, a feeling she hated but couldn't shake. When Caleb finally emerged, he looked tired. He went straight to the front desk where a young assistant had just arrived. "Put it all on my card," he said quietly, pulling a black credit card from his wallet. Maya shot up from her chair. "No," she protested, hurrying over. "You can't. You've done enough." I can set up a payment plan. I'll sell something." Caleb turned to her, and for the first time, his expression softened into a slight smile. "Maya," he said, using her name for the first time, which made her heart skip a beat. "You're out of a job, and Trent's father isn't going to make it easy for you to get another one quickly. Let me do this. Consider it an investment in a good dog." He didn't wait for her to argue. He swiped the card, settling a bill that Maya knew would have taken her months to pay. It wasn't charity. It was a mission. He was securing the perimeter, making sure the asset was safe. It was the only way he knew how to operate. While they waited for the anesthesia to wear off, Caleb and Dr. Peterson stood on the clinic's back porch, watching the sun begin to dip lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the fields. Sam lit a pipe, the sweet smell of cherry tobacco drifting on the air. Clean break of the femur, Sam said, looking out at the horizon. I pinned it. He's young. He's got good bone. He'll heal, but it's going to take time. 6 weeks, minimum. He needs rest, restricted movement, no running, no jumping. It'll be a full-time job keeping a puppy that's still. He turned to look at Caleb, his eyes narrowed slightly behind his glasses. But I'm not worried about the dog, Caleb. I'm looking at you. Your wound is tight as a guitar string. Caleb leaned against the railing, crossing his arms. He didn't look at Sam. I'm fine, he lied, the standard issue response of every soldier since the dawn of war. Don't give me that, Sam grunted. I was a corpsman in the Central Highlands in '68, son. I stitched up boys who were holding their own guts in, and they all told me they were fine. He took a puff of his pipe. I heard about your team, the ambush in the valley. Heard you were the only one who walked out without a scratch. Caleb's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. The mention of the ambush brought the noise back, the ringing in his ears, the smell of cordite and burning diesel, the screams that had suddenly gone silent. It wasn't a valley, Caleb whispered, his voice hoarse. It was a village, and I didn't walk out without a scratch. I just wasn't bleeding. Sam nodded slowly, understanding the distinction. Survivor's guilt is a heavy rucksack to carry. That why you're here, Caleb? Medical leave. Caleb gave a curt nod. Mandatory, Psych Eval said I was operationally compromised. They said I needed to find my baseline. But there is no baseline, Sam. There's the mission, and then there's this. The quiet. The quiet is the loudest part. You're chasing ghosts, Sam said gently. You're looking for a fight to fight because peace feels unnatural. But hear me, Caleb. Saving that girl and that dog today. That was a mission, and a good one. Maybe the mission isn't over. Maybe it just changed parameters. He tapped his pipe out on the railing. Come on, the patient's waking up. They walked back inside, the heavy conversation hanging in the air like smoke. In the recovery room, the lights had been dimmed. Max was lying in a soft blanketed kennel, his back leg heavily bandaged and encased in a splint. The smell of antiseptic was strong, masking the scent of fear that had clung to the dog earlier. Maya was already there, sitting on the floor beside the cage, murmuring through the wire mesh. Caleb knelt beside her. As if sensing his presence, Max's eyes fluttered open. They were still hazy, clouded with the lingering effects of the drugs, but they focused on Caleb. The puppy gave a low, confused whimper. Caleb reached his hand through the bars, his fingers stroking the soft fur between the dog's ears. Hey, buddy, he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. You made it. You're safe now. The puppy sniffed his hand, recognizing the scent of the man who had carried him away from the pain. Slowly, painfully, Max shifted his weight. He craned his neck forward, and with a tongue as rough as sandpaper but as warm as life, he licked Caleb's palm. He didn't lick Maya. He didn't lick the vet. He licked the soldier. It was a simple, primal, instinctive gesture, but for Caleb, it was a thunderclap. He froze. He looked at his hand, then into the dog's eyes. In that gaze, there was no judgment, no expectation, no demand that he be a hero or a weapon. Just gratitude, absolute and unconditional trust. Caleb felt a wall inside his chest, a wall he had built brick by brick with every fallen comrade and every failed mission, begin to crack. A single, hot, unbidden tear escaped his eye and traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He wiped it away quickly, but not before Maya saw. She said nothing. She just reached out and placed her hand over his, anchoring him to the moment. He knows, she whispered. He knows you saved him. Caleb didn't pull his hand away. For the first time in months, since the ambush that had silenced his world, the ringing in his ears had stopped. In the quiet of a vet clinic with a broken dog and a broken girl, the soldier finally exhaled. The morning sun that rose over Oakhaven brought no warmth. It brought a cold, harsh judgment. Less than 12 hours after the incident on the 13th hole, Maya found herself standing on the curb outside the staff dormitories, a cardboard box of her meager possessions at her feet, and the splinted puppy whining softly in a carrier beside her, confused. The eviction had been swift and merciless. A security guard she'd shared coffee with just yesterday had supervised her packing, his eyes refusing to meet hers, muttering something about a violation of the lease agreement regarding pets. It was a lie, and they both knew it. This was power exerting its will. A silent message from the Covington family that she was no longer welcome in their world. Maya looked at the heavy oak door of the staff housing, which had been shut with a finality that echoed in her soul. She had $80 in her pocket, a dog with a broken leg, and nowhere to go. She dragged her belongings to the nearest bus stop, the plastic wheels of the carrier rattling unevenly on the sidewalk, each jolt sending a fresh pang of anxiety through her chest. She took refuge in a small, greasy spoon diner on the edge of town, a place of cracked vinyl booths and the smell of stale coffee, a world away from the manicured lawns of the country club. She bought a cup of tea just for an excuse to sit, tucking Max's carrier under the table. She was trying to formulate a plan when the door opened and the air in the room changed. A man walked in who clearly didn't belong. He was in his late 40s, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that cost more than Maya made in a year. His hair was silver and perfectly coiffed, and he carried a leather briefcase that looked soft as butter. This was Marcus Thorne, the Covington family's private lawyer, a man known in legal circles as the Silencer. He scanned the room, his lip curling slightly in distaste, until his eyes landed on Maya. He walked over, pulling out the chair opposite her without asking. "Ms. Rossi," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of genuine emotion, like an anchorman reading a tragedy. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I represent the Covington family. I think it's time we had a little talk about yesterday's unfortunate misunderstanding." Maya clutched her teacup, her knuckles white. "It wasn't a misunderstanding," she said, her voice shaky but defiant. "Trent broke my dog's leg." Thorne smiled, a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Perspective is a funny thing, Maya. My client recalls a dangerous, unleashed animal charging him on a private golf course. He acted in self-defense. However," Thorne paused, placing his briefcase on the table and flicking open the latches. "Mr. Covington is a generous man. He is currently running for state senate, as you know, and he prefers to keep the community harmonious. He'd like to help you get back on your feet." Thorne slid a piece of paper across the greasy table. It was a cashier's check. Maya looked down. $10,000. It was enough to pay off her mother's medical debts. It was enough for a year's rent on an apartment. It was freedom. "All you have to do," Thorne continued, sliding a second document forward, "is sign this non-disclosure agreement. It simply states that the events of yesterday never happened, that you will delete any pictures or videos you might have, and that you will never speak of the Covington family again. Simple." For a moment, the room was silent but for the hum of the refrigerator. $10,000. Maya looked at the check, then down at the carrier where Max slept, his leg encased in the splint Caleb had paid for. She thought of the pain in the puppy's eyes. She thought of Caleb standing in the sun, refusing to bow to a bully. If she took this money, she wasn't just selling her silence. She was selling her soul. She was selling the truth. Slowly, Maya reached out her hand. Thorne's smile widened, anticipating the surrender of the desperate. But instead of the pen, Maya took the check. With steady hands, she tore it in half. Then she tore it again. She let the pieces fall like confetti onto the table. "Tell Mr. Covington," Maya said, her voice finding a new, steel-hard resonance, "that his son is a coward, and tell him my integrity isn't for sale, not for 10,000, not for $1 million. Thorne's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, predatory look. He slammed his briefcase shut. "You're making a mistake, Ms. Rossi," he hissed, leaning forward. "You're a very small person picking a fight with a giant. You won't just lose, you'll be crushed. Enjoy the streets." He stood and stormed out, leaving Maya trembling, but feeling lighter than she had in years. Outside the diner, inside a black luxury sedan with tinted windows, Thorne made a call. She refused, he said into the phone. Tore up the check. On the other end of the line, the voice of Richard Covington, Trent's father, was ice. Richard was a man who saw people as either assets or liabilities, and he had zero tolerance for liabilities. "Then we have a problem, Marcus. If she talks, if she goes to the press with a sob story about a puppy, my poll numbers will tank. The family values platform doesn't work if my son is known as a dog beater. We can't rely on money anymore. We need to ensure she's incapable of talking. Scare her, run her out of town, do whatever it takes." The order had been given. The machine of power began to turn, moving from negotiation to elimination. Maya left the diner an hour later, the reality of her situation crashing back down on her. The sky had turned a bruised purple, heavy with impending rain. She sat on a bench near the bus station, pulling her thin jacket tight around her. She had nowhere to go. The local shelters were full, and no motel would take a crying puppy without a deposit she couldn't afford. Just as the first cold drops of rain began to fall, mingling with the tears on her face, a familiar rumble cut through the traffic noise. The old Jeep Wrangler pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the gloom. The passenger window rolled down, and Caleb looked out. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask why she was there. He just looked at the box and the carrier. "Get in," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an extraction. Maya didn't argue. She climbed into the passenger seat, the warmth of the heater enveloping her like a blanket. "They fired me," she whispered as they pulled away. "And they tried to buy me off." Caleb glanced at her, his jaw tight. "Figured as much," he said. "People like that all have the same playbook. Money, then fear." He drove her out of the city, away from the neon lights and the judgment, deep into the forested hills that bordered the county. They drove for 30 minutes until the asphalt turned to gravel, winding up a steep incline surrounded by dense pine forest. Finally, they came to a clearing. Caleb's home was a cabin, but not a vacation rental. It was a structure built of heavy timber and stone, solid and unyielding. A faded American flag hung from the porch, and a stack of firewood was seasoned and piled with mathematical precision. It was a place of solitude, a fortress against the world. "You're safe here," Caleb said. "There's a guest room. Max can sleep by the fire." Inside, the cabin was Spartan but immaculate. It smelled of cedar and gun oil. While Maya got Max settled on a rug before the fireplace, Caleb went back outside. He told her he needed to check the perimeter, a habit he couldn't break. The rain was falling harder now, hammering on the roof of the Jeep. Caleb circled the vehicle, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He checked the tires, the undercarriage. It was a routine he'd performed 1,000 times in the desert, checking for IEDs or sabotage. He didn't expect to find anything here, in America, at his home. But as he swept the light under the rear bumper, the beam caught a reflection. Something that didn't belong. Caleb slid under the muddy chassis. There, attached by a magnet to the frame near the rear axle, was a small black box blinking with a faint red LED light. A GPS tracker, modern, military-grade, expensive, the kind used by private investigators and thugs. Caleb's breath caught, then steadied, his eyes narrowing, pupils dilating not with fear, but with a sudden, sharp clarity. The fatigue of the past months, the fog of PTSD, evaporated instantly. This wasn't a legal dispute anymore. This wasn't just a rich kid throwing a tantrum. Someone had followed him. Someone had tagged his vehicle to find out where he lived, where he was taking the girl. They had brought the war to his doorstep. He reached up and pulled the device free, holding it in his palm. The rain ran down his face, but he didn't feel it. Inside the cabin, Maya was making tea, safe for the moment. But outside, in the dark, wet woods, the threat had escalated. Caleb crushed the device in his fist, destroying the transmitter. He stood up, his posture changed. The civilian was gone. The SEAL was back. He looked out into the dark forest, his senses expanding, listening for the snap of a twig or the hum of an engine. "All right," he whispered into the darkness, a cold promise hanging on his lips. "You want to play games? Let's play." He turned and walked back toward the cabin, bolting the heavy door behind him, checking the load in the pistol he kept by the door. The siege had begun. 3 weeks had passed since the rainy extraction from the city, and the rhythm of life in the highlands had transformed the cabin's occupants. What began as a desperate flight had settled into a routine of disciplined serenity, a stark contrast to the chaotic world they had left behind. The cabin, tucked deep in a dense grove of pine and fir, was no longer just a shelter. It had become a sanctuary, and more importantly, a fortress. The air here was thin and clean, smelling of resin and damp earth, a scent that filled the lungs and cleared the mind. For Maya, the transition was jarring at first. She was used to the constant noise of traffic and the subservient bow to wealthy patrons. Here, under the vast, indifferent sky, she was learning to stand up straight. Caleb was not a man of many words, but his actions were a constant curriculum. The days started at dawn. There was no sleeping in. They chopped wood, not just for heat but to build strength. They hauled water from the spring, the icy chill of it burning the sleep from their veins. It was a hard life, but an honest one. And in the quiet labor, Maya found a new kind of peace. Max, the German Shepherd puppy, was the barometer of their progress. The splint on his leg was still there, a white badge of his survival, but he was no longer the whimpering victim from the golf course. Under Caleb's supervision and Dr. Sam's guidance, Max was thriving. He had grown noticeably in the 3 weeks, his chest broadening and his ears finally standing at permanent attention in perfect triangles. He couldn't run yet, but he limped with a determination that mirrored his rescuers. He followed Caleb everywhere, his dark eyes tracking every move, absorbing the man's quiet confidence. When the wind howled across the porch, Max no longer hid under the table. He sat by the door, a low rumble in his throat, practicing the growl he would one day use to defend his pack. He was learning he wasn't just a dog. He was a guardian in training. The afternoons were reserved for a different kind of education. In a clearing behind the house, shielded by a natural earthen berm, Caleb set up targets. He didn't hand Maya a weapon right away. For the first week, he taught her situational awareness. He taught her to listen to the birds. When they stopped singing, something was wrong. He taught her how to walk without snapping a twig, how to breathe through the stress. When he finally put a cold, heavy pistol in her hand, it wasn't about violence. It was about control. A weapon is just a tool, Caleb explained, his voice low and even as he adjusted her grip. Like a hammer or a wrench. It doesn't make you dangerous. Your mind makes you dangerous. This just extends your will. Maya was terrified at first, the weight of the steel alien in her palm. But Caleb stood behind her, his presence a solid wall of support. He corrected her stance, told her to lean into the recoil, to stop apologizing for taking up space. When she finally fired, hitting the tin can propped on a stump 20 yards away, the shock wasn't of fear. It was of power. She looked at the hole in the can, then back at Caleb. He gave a slight, rare nod. Good, he said. Now do it again. In those moments, the caddie who had been slapped and silenced began to fade, replaced by a woman who realized she had a right to defend her own existence. But the strength didn't flow in one direction. If Caleb was teaching Maya how to survive the day, she was teaching him how to survive the night. The war Caleb had left behind in the desert refused to stay there. It followed him into his sleep, lurking in the shadows of his bedroom. Several times a week, Maya would be woken by thrashing and choked cries coming from the living room, where Caleb slept on the couch, having insisted she take the bed. The first time it had happened, she had been terrified. Now she knew what to do. She would pad softly into the room, the moonlight casting long shadows on the floor. She wouldn't shake him. That would trigger a fight response. Instead, she would sit on the floor near his head and speak softly. You're at the cabin, Caleb. You're in Oakhaven. The birds are asleep. Max is here. I'm here. Her voice, low and rhythmic, was an anchor. Slowly, the tension would leave his body. He would wake with a gasp, his shirt soaked in sweat, his eyes wide with the horror of a memory she couldn't see. When he realized where he was, shame would wash over him. I'm sorry, he would whisper, burying his face in his hands. You shouldn't have to see this. Maya would reach out, daring to touch his shoulder, her hand warm on his cold skin. You saved me from a monster in the daylight, she told him one night, her voice firm. Let me save you from the ones in the dark. In those quiet hours, a bond was forged that was deeper than romance. It was a profound codependence, a shared understanding that they were both broken things trying to piece each other back together. The peace of the woods, however, was a deception, and Caleb knew it. He had found the tracker on his Jeep 3 weeks ago, and though he destroyed it, he knew the silence from the Covington family wasn't an end, but a pause to reload. While Maya and Max slept or rested, Caleb turned the cabin into a hard target. He didn't dig trenches or build walls. He used technology and nature. He installed wireless motion sensor cameras in the trees along the access road, hidden in birdhouses. He ran tripwires made of fishing line across the most likely avenues of approach, not to trigger explosives, but to set off simple chimes inside the house. An early warning system. He checked the window locks daily. He cleared brush around the perimeter to eliminate hiding spots. He was a spider weaving a web, waiting for the fly to return. He knew that men like Richard Covington didn't give up. They had money, and money bought persistence. They wanted the phone Maya had kept, the old smartphone that held the videos of the abuse at the golf course, the only leverage she had. Caleb had encrypted the data and hidden the phone. But the enemy didn't know that. They would come for it, and they would come with force. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night, on the back of a Gulf storm that slammed into the coast. Thunder rolled through the valleys like artillery, rattling the window panes. Rain lashed the cabin in sheets, turning the world outside into a blurred gray mess. Inside, the fire was roaring, but the air was tense. Max was pacing, his ears flat, a low, constant rumble in his throat. He sensed the change in barometric pressure, or perhaps something more ancient. Caleb stood by the window, peering through the blinds. The storm was perfect cover. The wind would mask footsteps. The dark would hide movement. It was exactly the kind of night he would have chosen for an assault. Suddenly, a small red light on a panel Caleb had rigged on the bookshelf blinked once, then twice. It was the sensor on the outer perimeter, 200 yards up the gravel drive. Caleb didn't jump. He went perfectly still. "Maya," he said, his voice cutting through the rain, calm and authoritative. "Kill the lights. Now." Maya, trained by 3 weeks of drills, didn't ask why. She hit the main breaker, plunging the cabin into darkness. "Get Max, go into the bathroom, lock the door, get in the tub, and stay down." She scooped up the growling puppy, who was now barking at the door, the fur on his neck raised. "Caleb," she whispered, fear creeping back into her voice. "Are they here?" Caleb moved to the gun safe, the tumblers clicking quietly under his fingers. He pulled out a shotgun, the sound of him racking around into the chamber loud and final in the dark room. He moved to the side of the window, monitoring the grainy feed from his tablet connected to the exterior cameras. On the screen, 4 figures were moving tactically up the drive, dressed in dark rain gear, carrying tools that were not for golf. They carried pry bars and what looked like weighted batons. They weren't here to talk. They were here to clean up the situation. "Yeah," Caleb whispered, his eyes narrowing as he watched the predators walk into his trap. "They're here. But they forgot one thing." He glanced toward the sound of the trembling girl and the defiant dog. "They forgot who lives here." The first figure reached the porch steps, and the front doorknob rattled. The fortress had been breached. The wait was over. The storm outside had reached its crescendo, the wind shrieking through the Douglas firs like a banshee mourning the dead. But the violence inside the cabin began with a much cleaner, more terrifying sound. The heavy, oak front door, bolted and reinforced, shuddered under a massive impact, then burst inward with a deafening crack that drowned out the thunder. 5 figures spilled into the living room, bringing the cold, wet smell of rain and malice with them. They were dressed in expensive-looking black tactical gear, but wore it with the sloppy arrogance of bullies, not fighters. They wore ski masks, their hands gripping pry bars and weighted saps, expecting a scared girl and a sleeping man. The leader, a massive hulk of a man who filled the doorway and whose breath wheezed through his mask like a broken bellows, swept a heavy maglite beam across the empty couch. "Find the girl," he grunted, his voice muffled. "Get the phone. Hurt the dog if you have to. Leave the guy to me." They moved with heavy-footed, stomping steps, defiling the sanctuary Caleb had built. They didn't know the empty room wasn't a sign of surrender. It was an invitation into the lion's den. Caleb, crouched in the shadows of the kitchen hallway, watched them through a crack in the doorframe. His heart rate had slowed, not increased. This was the warrior's paradox. As the world descended into chaos, his mind found a crystal-clear stillness. He held no gun in his hands. The shotgun was propped against the wall, a last resort. In the tight quarters, with Maya so close, a stray pellet was a risk he wouldn't take. Instead, he wielded the darkness. With a silent breath, he reached up to the breaker box on the wall behind him and threw the master switch down. The cabin plunged into absolute, profound blackness. The sudden loss of light was instantly disorienting to the intruders. Confused shouts erupted. "Lights! Get the lights on!" The leader roared, his beam slashing erratically through the dust motes in the air. But before they could adjust, the hunt had begun. Caleb didn't move like a man. He moved like vapor. He knew every creaking floorboard, every corner of the furniture. He slipped into the living room, a ghost in the machine. The first thug, a wiry man nearest the kitchen, never saw him coming. Caleb materialized out of the void, grabbed the man's wrist and twisted it with a sickening pop, sending the pry bar clattering to the floor. Before the man could scream, Caleb's other hand drove into his solar plexus, collapsing his diaphragm. The intruder folded in on himself in silence, trying to draw a breath that wouldn't come. Caleb gently laid him on the floor. One down. The remaining 4 were now flashing their lights frantically, their bravado evaporating. "Over there. I heard something." One shouted, swinging a sap at a shadow. The beam caught nothing but a bookshelf. From the darkness behind him, Caleb struck again. A leg sweep, a precisely placed chop to the carotid artery, and the second man went down like a sack of cement. It wasn't a fight, it was a dismantling. Caleb was taking them apart piece by piece, methodically and coldly. The chaos of the fight, however, had created an opening. 2 of the intruders, realizing the main room was a kill zone, pushed through the furniture toward the back hallway, toward the bathroom where Maya was hiding. The girls in the back, one yelled, seeing the closed door. Inside the tiny bathroom, Maya cowered in the dry bathtub, her arms wrapped around Max. The puppy was vibrating with tension, a low, guttural growl coming from his chest that sounded too deep for such a young animal. When the doorknob rattled and then shattered under a kick, Maya didn't scream. She remembered Caleb's voice in the clearing. "Panic is the enemy. Breathe. Focus. The door flew open and a flashlight beam blinded her. The intruder, a man with a snake tattoo on his neck above his collar, grinned beneath his mask. "Found you, sweetheart," he sneered, stepping into the room, reaching for her. He had forgotten about the dog. Max, despite the heavy splint on his leg and the pain that must have been shooting through his hip, did not hesitate. Tapping into a dormant gene passed down through generations of working dogs, he launched himself forward. He didn't run. He exploded from a sitting position, a furry cannonball of teeth and righteous fury. He clamped his jaws on the intruder's forearm, biting down with all the strength of his young jaw. The man screamed, a high-pitched shriek of shock and pain, and tried to shake the puppy off, flailing his arm wildly. Max yelped as he was slammed against the doorframe, but he refused to let go, his growls turning to vicious snarls. The intruder stumbled backward, off balance, distracted by the 40 pounds of determination hanging from his arm. It was the moment Maya needed. She rose up in the tub, holding the heavy porcelain lid of the toilet tank she had grabbed as a weapon. With a cry not of fear, but of defiance, she brought it crashing down on the man's shoulder. The impact was solid. The man grunted and crumpled to the floor, stunned, dropping his weapon. Max let go, panting, and stood on 3 legs over the fallen man, barking a warning to any others who dared enter. Back in the living room, the tide had turned completely. The 4th man, seeing his partners fall to an invisible foe, had made a run for the door, scrambling over the wreckage in a desperate bid to escape into the rain. Caleb let him go. Fear would spread the message faster than violence. That left only the leader. The brute stood in the middle of the room, swinging a heavy iron pipe, his flashlight creating erratic, dancing shadows. "Show yourself," he bellowed, his voice trembling with terror. "Stop hiding like a rat." Caleb stepped into the beam of light, his hands empty, his face calm. "I wasn't hiding," Caleb said, his voice terrifyingly even. "I was waiting." The leader roared and charged, swinging the pipe with murderous intent. Caleb didn't back away. He stepped inside the arc of the swing, a move so dangerous it seemed to freeze the air. He blocked the man's arm, using the attacker's own momentum against him. With a pivot of his hips, Caleb executed a perfect shoulder throw, sending the huge man flying through the air. The leader crashed through the coffee table, shattering it. Before he could get up, Caleb was on him, his knee pressed into the man's back, pinning him to the floor. He took the man's wrist and cranked it up behind his shoulder blade until the leader slapped the floor in surrender. "Stay down," Caleb whispered in his ear. "Or I'll break it." The fight was over. Silence returned, broken only by the groans of the men on the floor and the steady drumming of the rain outside. Caleb stood, pulling a bundle of heavy-duty zip ties from his tactical vest. He was always prepared. He moved efficiently from one groaning man to the next, binding their hands and feet with professional speed. He dragged them into a line in the middle of the room, looking like trussed turkeys waiting for the oven. Then he walked to the breaker box and flipped the switch. The lights flickered back on, revealing the devastation. Overturned furniture, broken glass, and 4 defeated men on the rug. Caleb went to the bathroom door. Maya was sitting on the edge of the tub, her hand resting on Max's head. The puppy was licking his splint, looking exhausted but proud. The intruder on the floor was groaning, clutching a bruised shoulder and a bleeding arm. Caleb looked at the scene, the porcelain lid on the floor, the bite marks on the intruder, the steel in Maya's eyes. He didn't say a word. He just nodded, a look of profound respect passing between them. He bent down and pulled the dazed intruder out of the bathroom by his belt, dragging him to join his friends in the living room. Then he came back, kneeling in front of Maya and Max. "Are you hurt?" he asked, checking Maya's face for bruises. "No," she said, her voice a little shaky as the adrenaline began to fade. "Max, he saved me." He bit him. Caleb looked at the puppy, whose tail was thumping against the tile. "He did his job," Caleb said softly, scratching Max behind the ears. "And so did you." He helped them up and led them into the living room. The leader of the thugs, now unmasked to reveal the scarred, brutish face of a career criminal, glared at them. "You're a dead man," the man growled, though the fear in his eyes betrayed him. "Mr. Covington will bury you." Caleb stood over him, looking down with more pity than anger. "Covington thinks money is power," Caleb said, pulling out his phone to call 911. "He thinks you can buy loyalty and fear, but he forgot you can't buy courage, and you can't buy the heart of a wolf." He looked at Maya and Max, standing together, bruised but unbroken. "We're not going anywhere," Caleb said into the phone as the dispatcher answered. "Send the sheriff. I have some trash for him to pick up." The fortress had held. The night was theirs. The storm had passed, leaving a heavy, damp silence in the woods that was soon broken by the wail of approaching sirens. The flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers cut through the darkness, painting the wet pine trees in a chaotic light show. Caleb stood on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest, his posture relaxed but alert. Behind him, in the warm light of the living room, Maya sat on the couch, her arm around Max, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and residual anxiety. The driveway, usually so desolate, was now a parking lot of official vehicles. Sheriff Jim Brody stepped out of the lead car, his boots crunching on the gravel. Brody was a man in his late 50s with a face like worn leather and tired, heavy-lidded eyes that had seen every petty crime and tragedy Oakhaven had to offer. He adjusted his hat against the drizzle and walked up the steps, his hand resting instinctively near his holster, though he didn't draw. He looked past Caleb through the open door and saw the 5 zip-tied men on the living room floor, groaning in discomfort. He let out a long, weary sigh. "Caleb," Brody said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Dispatch said you had a break-in. This looks more like a war zone." "Home invasion, Sheriff," Caleb corrected him calmly. 5 armed men, forced entry. We defended ourselves." Before Brody could press for details, the crunch of expensive tires on gravel announced a new arrival. A sleek black limousine, absurdly out of place on the muddy mountain road, pulled up behind the police cars. The back door flew open and Richard Covington emerged. He was a man who wore power like a suit of armor, tall with perfectly styled silver hair and a camel hair overcoat that cost more than the sheriff's annual salary. Trailing behind him were his son Trent, looking smug and untouched, and Marcus Thorne, the lawyer from the diner. Covington didn't look at the sheriff. He marched straight for the porch, his face a mask of manufactured outrage. "Sheriff, arrest this man immediately," Covington boomed, pointing a manicured finger at Caleb. "He's a dangerous lunatic. My son's friends were concerned for the girl. They came to check on her, and this barbarian attacked them and took them hostage." Trent stepped up beside his father, a sneer on his lips. "That's right, Sheriff," Trent lied, his voice dripping with self-righteousness. "We heard he'd kidnapped Maya. My friends just wanted to help. Look at them. He tortured them." The brazenness of the lie was breathtaking. Inside, Maya stood up, trembling with anger, but Caleb held up a hand, signaling for her to stay put. He didn't interrupt. He let them talk. He let the arrogance flow freely. Sheriff Brody looked between the bound men, clearly dressed in tactical gear and not wellness check attire, and the polished politician. "Mr. Covington," Brody said carefully. "These men are wearing ski masks and carrying pry bars. That doesn't look like a wellness check." Covington waved a dismissive hand. "It's raining. They were protecting themselves from the elements. Now listen to me, Brody. I am the next senator from this district. If you don't put this maniac in cuffs for assault and unlawful imprisonment, I will have your badge before breakfast. And don't bother looking for evidence at the golf course of whatever fairy tale that girl has told you. The security tapes were unfortunately damaged in the heat wave. There is no proof of anything except what happened here tonight." Covington smiled, a cold, predatory smile. He thought he had won. He had erased the past and he controlled the present. But the sound of more approaching engines cut his victory short. It wasn't more police. It was a caravan of old pickup trucks, sedans, and battered SUVs. They parked on the grass on either side of the police cars. Doors opened and townspeople emerged. There was Dr. Sam, looking fierce in an old field jacket. Behind him were a dozen men and women, members of the local VFW post, retired mechanics, the bridge ladies from the club, the very people Covington ignored. They didn't shout, they just stood there, a silent wall of witnesses, their breath pluming in the cold air. Dr. Sam walked up to the police tape, nodding to the sheriff. "We heard the scanner, Jim," Sam said. "We're just here to make sure everything stays on the level." Covington's smile faltered. An audience wasn't part of the plan. Caleb finally moved. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "You're right, Richard," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the tension, calm and amplified by the crowd's silence. "You erased the golf course footage. You thought that erased the truth?" Caleb tapped the screen and held up the phone. "But you forgot we live in the digital age. And you forgot your lawyer is sloppy." He pressed play. The voice of Marcus Thorne, clear and undeniable, came from the speaker, echoing in the damp night air. "Mr. Covington is a generous man. $10,000. Sign this non-disclosure agreement. State that the events of yesterday never happened. Allow us to clean up the situation." The color drained from Richard Covington's face. Marcus Thorne looked like he was going to be sick. A murmur went through the crowd, a low rumble of anger and validation. Caleb wasn't done. And as for tonight, he continued, pointing up at the birdhouse in the tree near the porch, motion-activated 4K video with an instant cloud upload. I have footage of your wellness check team cutting my power, breaking down my door, and entering my home with weapons. And I have footage of them admitting you sent them. Caleb looked at the sheriff. It's all in your inbox already, Jim. Kidnapping, attempted murder, conspiracy, and bribery. Sheriff Brody looked at Covington. The weariness in his eyes was replaced by a steely resolve. He had taken an oath, and politics be damned, he was a lawman. He turned to the deputy beside him. Cuff them, Brody said, gesturing to the men on the floor. Then he turned to Richard Covington. And him. Covington sputtered, backing away, his power dissolving like wet sand. You can't do this. Do you know who I am? I am this town. Brody pulled his cuffs from his belt, the metal clicking ominously. Right now, you're just a suspect in a felony investigation. Turn around. As the sheriff snapped the cuffs on the tycoon's wrists, Trent tried to slip away toward the limo. And the boy, Brody added sharply. He's an accessory, and I bet if we dig, we'll find he ordered the assault. Two deputies grabbed Trent, who started to cry, screaming for his father to fix it. But his father was being pushed into the back of a patrol car. Maya stepped onto the porch, Max limping bravely beside her. She watched as the untouchable giants of Oakhaven were reduced to common criminals. The flashing lights illuminated the faces of the veterans and the townspeople. Dr. Sam gave a thumbs up, a weathered smile on his face. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was a moral one. The community had rejected the rot. Caleb walked over to the sheriff, who was shaking his head. I'm sorry it came to this, Caleb, Brody said. I should have looked into the golf course thing sooner. Caleb shook the sheriff's hand. You're doing the right thing now, Jim. That's what matters. As the police caravan began to turn around, taking the Covingtons and their hired thugs to the county jail, the wall of veterans parted to let them pass, watching with grim satisfaction. The storm had truly passed. The air was clean. Justice, delayed but not denied, had finally come to the mountain. The weeks that followed the arrest of the Covington family brought a quiet, clean wind to the town of Oakhaven, sweeping away the humidity of the corruption that had held the valley for so long. It was as if the town itself had taken a long, deep breath. The sheriff's investigation, fortified by the irrefutable digital evidence Caleb had provided and the testimony of the veterans, was swift and uncompromising. Richard Covington withdrew from the Senate race in disgrace. His campaign posters peeled off telephone poles like dead skin, replaced by the green shoots of hope from a community reclaiming its dignity. For Maya, the transformation wasn't just about justice. It was about rebirth. She no longer walked with her head down, afraid of shadows. She had found a new home, not in the remote cabin, but in the heart of the town she now felt a part of. Dr. Sam had been true to his word. He didn't just give her a job, he gave her a calling. The vet clinic, with its smell of pine and antiseptic, became her sanctuary. She wore the blue surgical scrubs with a pride she never felt in the white polo of the country club. She had a natural gift with the animals, a gentle touch born of her own trauma that soothed the scared cats and anxious dogs that came through the door. She was learning to heal others, and in doing so, she was mending the tears in her own soul. Max was living proof of this healing. His recovery had defied even Dr. Sam's most optimistic projections. It had been nearly 2 months since the golf course. The splint was gone, replaced by a slight, rhythmic stiffness in his gait that only a trained eye could see. A warrior's limp that gave him more character than weakness. He had grown into his paws, his chest deep and broad, his coat sleek with the health of good food and constant love. He was no longer a victim. He was the clinic's unofficial mascot and guardian. When he wasn't shadowing Maya as she cleaned kennels or prepped rooms, he sat by the front door, his ears swiveling like radar dishes, watching the street. He carried a gravity that belonged to an older dog, as if the fight in the cabin had aged his spirit, stripping away the frivolity of puppyhood and leaving the stoic heart of a wolf. He was ready for the world. But the world, as Caleb knew better than anyone, was a place that extracted its price. The call came on a Tuesday, a crisp morning when the first hint of autumn was in the air. Caleb was splitting wood behind the cabin, the rhythmic thud of the axe echoing through the trees, a moving meditation. He didn't have to look at the caller ID when the phone buzzed on the tree stump. He knew the protocol. The leave was over. The psych eval had been passed, likely expedited by the news of his actions in Oakhaven, which had quietly made its way to his commanding officers. A soldier who could dismantle a criminal conspiracy without firing a lethal shot was a soldier ready to return to the line. He packed his duffel with the same military precision he applied to everything. Socks tightly rolled, gear checked, nothing extraneous. He cleaned the cabin, leaving it as spotless as a museum exhibit, a place waiting for a ghost to return. He felt a pang of sadness, sharp and sudden, not for leaving the place, but for leaving the peace he had found within it. But he also felt the pull of the trident, the call of the brotherhood. He was a man of two worlds, and the other one was calling him home. He picked Maya up from the clinic just as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and golds. He didn't say much, but he didn't have to. Maya saw the duffel bag in the back of the Jeep. She saw the set of his jaw, the way his eyes were focused on some distant space. She knew. They drove in silence to the Old Town Pier, a wooden structure that jutted out into the Gulf of Mexico, weathered by decades of salt and storms, but still standing. It was a place of endings and beginnings. The sea churned beneath them, dark and restless, mirroring the turmoil in Maya's chest. They walked to the end of the pier, the wind whipping Maya's hair across her face. Max trotted beside them, not bouncing or playing, but pacing himself to Caleb's stride, sensing the solemnity of the moment. Caleb stopped at the railing and looked out at the vast, dark water. "My orders came in," he said, his voice fighting the wind. "I deploy in 48 hours. San Diego first, then somewhere else." He didn't look at her as he spoke, afraid that if he saw the tears he knew were welling, his resolve would crumble like wet sand. Maya wrapped her arms around herself, shivering slightly in the sea breeze. "I knew this day would come," she said, her voice even despite the lump in her throat. "You don't belong here, Caleb. You belong out there, saving people who have no one else." She turned to him, her eyes fierce and dry. "You saved me. You saved Max. You gave us a life. I'm not going to ask you to stay. That would be selfish, and I know you don't do selfish." Caleb turned to face her. The hard lines of his face softened, the soldier's mask slipping to reveal the man beneath. He looked at the woman who had helped him chase away his nightmares, who had shown him there was something worth fighting for at home. He looked down at Max, who sat at a perfect hill between them, looking up at Caleb with unblinking, adoring eyes. The dog nudged his wet nose into Caleb's hand, a silent gesture of solidarity. Caleb knelt, ignoring the grime on his jeans, and wrapped his arms around the dog's neck. He buried his face in the thick fur for a long moment, breathing in the scent of the life he had saved. "You hold the perimeter, buddy," he whispered into the dog's ear. "You're the alpha now." He stood and reached into the pocket of his denim jacket. He pulled out something small and heavy. It glinted in the fading light, gold and silver, fierce and sharp. It was the special warfare insignia, the trident, the eagle, the anchor, the pistol. It represented dominion over sea, air, and land. It was the hardest thing he had ever earned, a symbol of endurance and brotherhood that had defined his entire existence. He took Maya's hand, opened her fingers, and pressed the cool metal into her palm. "I can't tell you where I'm going," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I can't promise I won't get hurt, but I can promise you this." He closed her fingers around the pin, holding her fist in his own big hands. "That trident, it always comes back to port. It's my compass. You hold it for me. As long as you have it, I have a reason to come home." Maya looked down at the pin, feeling its weight, its sharp edges. It was a piece of his soul. "I'll keep it safe," she whispered. "We both will." She reached up and touched his cheek, her thumb tracing the scar on his jaw. "Go. Do what you have to do. We'll be here. Standing watch." Caleb nodded, a single, final gesture. He didn't kiss her. A kiss was a goodbye. And this wasn't a goodbye. It was a mission briefing. He took a step back, gave the girl and the dog a sharp, definitive salute, a gesture of ultimate respect normally reserved for officers, and turned away. He walked back down the pier, his boots thudding on the wood, a lone figure moving against the vastness of the ocean. He climbed into his Jeep, the engine roaring to life like a waking beast. As he drove away, he looked in the rearview mirror only once. He saw them standing there, their silhouettes framed against the dying light. The girl, standing straight and tall, her hand clutching the insignia to her heart. And the dog, the German shepherd with the heart of a wolf, sitting at a solemn, perfect watch beside her, observing as the vehicle disappeared. They didn't look broken. They didn't look abandoned. They looked like a fortress. They looked like hope. Caleb smiled, a sad but genuine smile, and pointed the Jeep toward the highway, toward the war, carrying the image of his family into the night.